Hey everybody, just spending some of my time here just watching some YouTube videos. This one I searched for how to choose the right line on YouTube here, and this guy in particular is Brian Latimer. I don't know if everybody's familiar with him or not. He's on the Bass Pro Tour. He's a real up and comer. I've been kind of watching a lot of his videos lately. He's real good at explaining things, real down to earth, real humble. Shoot, he's even kind of funny sometimes. So I'm just gonna play the video and let you guys watch along with me.
Spin and tackle finesse presentations. I got 3-pound tests that I really think you guys should have. If you don't have anything else, you just starting from scratch. All right, you just start from scratch, just getting into fishing. 3 different line sizes or pound tests that I think you gotta have. Number 1, let's start with on the finesse side. We'll start at the small side and we'll work our way to the heaviest. 8-pound test. So 8-pound test obviously is gonna be the smallest that I want to go. I very rarely use any smaller than 8-pound test. With fluorocarbon line, usually the diameter is very small. It has very little to no light refraction, which means it's less visible than any other line. So I very rarely go smaller than 8-pound test. 8-pound test is going to be my leading material when I'm using my spinning rods to go from braid to fluoro. If you're not sure what braid to fluoro combination is and curious to how I set that up, what my connection knots and my union knots is for braid to fluoro, I'll put a link in the description box of what I like to use for that. But let's just focus right on the line sizes today in this video. 8-pound test. What I like about it, if I'm using it on spinning equipment and I'm not really sure how to make a union knot from braid to fluorocarbon, which is totally normal. You can't tie a braid to fluorocarbon knot. Don't freak out. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't fish, that you won't fish, that you're not good enough fisherman. It's not really that easy for you guys that are starting off. Start off with just straight fluorocarbon on your spinning reel and use 6 or 8-pound tests. When you use 10 and larger on a spinning reel, it's going to be really hard to manage. What I mean by that, it's going to want to come off the spool. Fluorocarbon is a really stiff material, so when you coil it up on the spool, it wants to come back off of it. It's very springy, very coily. It doesn't have any air in it. That's the difference between mono and fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon is excrete all the air out of the resin or the material, so it's a lot stiffer. It's solid material. That's all it is. So 8-pound test works really good on spinning equipment. Also, if I need to, I can use it on bait casting equipment. I tend to not like to use 8-pound tests on bait casting equipment because it is a lighter pound test. The reason I like not only because it's more manageable on the spinning reel, but with the smaller pound test, obviously it's going to be easier to break the lines. Your drag setup is going to be a lot more important. Bait casters tend not to have quite as smooth of a drag system as a spinning reel does. So 8-pound test is going to be better for that. I'm going to use this for Ned rigs, drop shots, shaky heads, small crankbaits, stuff like that is what you're going to use for your 8-pound test. Keep in mind there's a lot of different, there's 10, 12 in between here. Typically, some companies even have 14-pound tests. But what I'm trying to show you guys is 3-pound tests that you can start from scratch that you need to have. I'm going to go from 8-pound tests all the way to 15-pound tests. 15-pound test is going to be pretty much strictly for bait casting equipment. And if I had bait casting equipment and only had one bait caster and one rod that I could spool up with fluorocarbon, this would be the pound test that I would use. 15-pound test fluorocarbon. Here's why. 15-pound test is strong enough to be able to pull fish out of structure, but it's strong enough that if I want to throw a spinner bait, I can do that. But yet it's small enough that if I want to throw a Texas rig in very clear water, I can use it for that. 15-pound test is very versatile. You can put a little stank on your hook sets. It's still manageable enough that you can cast really lightweight lures. One thing you'll notice about the bigger pound test line you get, the harder it's going to be to throw small crankbaits like balsa crankbaits or lighter lures. Right now I've got this rod rigged up with 15-pound test and a Texas rig on here. The Texas rig with 3/16-ounce sinker, which is fairly light. If I were to have 20-pound test on here with this lighter sinker, this bait would be really difficult to cast, and I'd get a lot of backlash. I'd have a lot of problems with it. The 15-pound test is not as coily as 20-pound test is, so it allows me to cast it further. It allows me to have less backlash. So 15-pound test is that happy medium between being strong enough to power fish with, but yet small enough to get distance with light lures and be able to fish it in extremely clear water. 15-pound test is probably going to be your middle of the ground line when you're talking about using fluorocarbon. Now, for situations where you really need big line, you're fishing heavy cover, a lot of laydowns, a lot of rocks. This is generally going to be for presentations like flipping, going to be for presentations like throwing heavier baits. Always consider the size and weight of your baits when you're choosing your line size. If I take a 15-pound test line or my 15-pound test fluorocarbon, I try to throw a 7-inch swim bait on it, it's not going to work out that good. Just casting it and that weight and that whipping motion of that bait is really hard on your knot, really hard on your line. So you're going to have to upsize your line. Always think about that. Smaller baits, smaller lures typically work best with smaller pound test line, okay? Bigger the baits go, the shorter the cast go, like flipping baits, flipping around structure, and heavier baits is when I'm going to go up to 20-pound test. 20-pound test, you know, I will go up as high as 25, but if I were only going to have 3, it would be 8, 15, and 20. 20-pound test is that line that I'm going to use when I'm flipping laydowns, when I'm flipping rocks, when I'm throwing a really heavy bait, a big swim bait, 7, 6, 7, 8, well, as small as a 5, 6, 7, 8 inch swim baits. This is what I'm going to use for that particular situation. You'll notice when you get into the bigger pound test, 20-pound test is going to be a little bit more springy on the spool. What I like to do to alleviate that, if you look at a lot of my reels, a lot of people look at my reels and they say, man, Brian, do you need some line? I notice you're not filling your spools all the way up to the end. The bigger the pound test is, the less line I like to use on my reels. This is why. Because the bigger the line is, the more dense that material is, the more it wants to spring and come off the reel. What I like to do is put less line on there. You have more spool to help contain that line. If I spool it all the way up to the brim of it, there's not enough metal to really hold that line in when it wants to spin off the reel so fast. Leaving a little gap in there will create a little more friction and contain that line when it wants to spool off the reel extremely fast. So just a little tip. The bigger the line, the less you want to put on your reel. It'll help you out a little bit. You'll see that reel looks like it's almost not even filled up. So I left almost an 8-inch gap between the line and the top of the spool. That helps out a lot. So 20-pound test, that's your go get 'em. If I had one just to pick out of all 3 of these, it would be 15-pound test on a bait caster. But these 3 lines are the sizes that I think you guys could use if you're wondering where to start when you're trying to pick out your line sizes. 8 for spinning reels and smaller lures, 15 for just about everything, and 20-pound test when you need a tow truck and you need to bring them out of there.
All right, so you know, Brian explained it pretty well there. You know, on spinning reels, I'm typically, you know, 6 or 8 pound test, or I'm going to go with 10-pound braid and then use that 6 or 8 pound test as a leader, and typically in either monofilament or fluorocarbon if the water is really, really clear. And like he said, on the bait casters for your general setups for spinner baits, chatter baits, some of your crankbaits, even Texas rigs, you know, flipping and pitching and stuff, and not heavy cover, that 15-pound range. There's sometimes I'll use, you know, 14 or 15 or 16, maybe even 17. But once I start getting up to 17 or into that 20 range, you know, 20 to 25 range, then I'm more putting that on my heavy rod for my flipping, pitching, you know, that heavy cover like he was talking about. So, I mean, he's pretty much spot on with all that. He was talking mostly mono there, but he did mention the fluoro. Another one he didn't mention was copolymer. Some people don't like it. I don't know. I've always been a fan of it. Used P-line copolymer for many, many years. I mean, it's just so abrasion resistant, but the major drawback to copolymer is that it has a lot of line memory, especially when you get into that higher pound test. Now, that abrasion resistance you get with it makes it so worthwhile. I mean, I've pulled 6-pound fish up with part of a brush pile without even having to cut and retie. I mean, that stuff's just, it's strong. It's really abrasion resistant. It has a little more stretch than obviously something like braid, but obviously not near as much stretch as a mono. So there's a little bit of give and take with it, but I think it's the perfect median for flipping, pitching into heavy cover when you do have to kind of worry about, you know, your line visibility. You know, braid is obviously highly visible unless you're just fishing in super muddy water. So anyways, that's a lot of it. Like I said, the P-line was a copolymer I used for a long time. I've been using, believe it or not, I know some people like them, some people don't. Cast King has a copolymer out that I find is every bit as abrasion resistant as P-line, but I have not noticed the extreme coiling, the line memory with Cast King's copolymer like I did with P-line. So, and that's my own observation. Take it for what it's worth. That's just some of my line choices, and obviously Brian Latimer, he's a pretty up and coming pro, so he's got a good deal there that he's talking about, and that's a way to kind of keep your line choices down to a relative simple minimum.